In this video, I wanted to talk about Linux vulnerabilities. Now, the first question you might ask yourself, why Linux? Well, there are a couple of reasons for this. Linux is the operating system by programmers for programmers. And one of the nice things about Linux is that it extracts the most performance from your hardware. So if you have older hardware, it runs well with Linux. If you have new hardware, it runs extremely well with Linux. So Linux is the perfect platform for doing exploit development, looking at vulnerabilities, and for most anything you want to do. It's very powerful, but at the same time, it's free. So you can't beat it for the price. Consequently, a lot of server rooms are running Linux. So if you go to an ISP, there's a very good chance that they're running Linux on their servers. They want to get the most performance they can. They don't want to give a lot of money to a big corporation. Speaking of big corporations, there are a lot of big corporations running Linux. Google has their own version of Linux that's based on Ubuntu. So you might have heard of Gubuntu. That is the Google version of Ubuntu. And there is another version of Ubuntu that would have been called Gubuntu, but it's called Ubuntu GNOME. That's GNOME edition, so that you're not confused with Ubuntu. So what kind of vulnerabilities do we have in Linux? Well, just like every system, we have Stack Overflow vulnerabilities that are possible. However, this situation is a little bit harder than Windows to exploit. And part of the reason for this is that stack protection is enabled by default in all recent versions of GCC, which is the most common compiler that people use when writing programs for Linux. We've already seen this in some of our examples where you have to disable stack protection in order to get a stack vulnerability in Linux. Also, depending on the version of Linux that you're running, the stack might not be executable. This means that you can't do the standard thing of overflowing a buffer that's on the stack and having that overflow contain your shellcode, which you then call. It's not impossible to exploit a stack vulnerability, it's just a lot harder. So, what about heap buffer overflows? Well, that's essentially the same as Windows. There are some minor differences. Windows uses one set of structures to store the various chunks of the heap that it's allocated, and Linux uses something different. And this is potentially complicated in Linux by non-executable memory. So you can have chunks of memory that are listed as non-executable. And it's very common if you have memory that is executable, it's marked as read-only to prevent these sorts of problems. So what about format string bugs? Format string bugs are not operating system specific. This is an error in the program, and it's an error in the use of some of the standard libraries. So Linux is vulnerable to format string bugs, just like everybody else. However, if you use a compiler such as GCC, it will tell you, hey, you could have a format string vulnerability. And you can even set your compiler flags so that warnings, just like that one, will turn into errors and your program will not build. Where are some other potential vulnerabilities in Linux? Well, the Linux kernel is not as small as it used to be. The current kernel is over 19 million lines of code, which sounds like a lot as long as you don't compare it to Windows. Windows is much bigger than this. But the potential for bugs exists whenever you're talking about 19 million lines of code. Also, as we'll find, if you exploit a vulnerability in the kernel, that could result in some sort of privilege escalation because you have a privileged process which has been exploited. We'll also talk about some complications in exploiting flaws in the kernel as well. But it's certainly possible that there are flaws out there that have been undiscovered. You could be the first to discover what we would call a 0-day because it hasn't been published yet. And if you do discover such a vulnerability, naturally the responsible thing to do would be to contact the kernel maintainers and tell them about it. But we will talk about all of these issues in some future videos.